Welcome, welcome, everyone. Welcome to the Unfazed, Unedited podcast, where we provide commentary on complicated topics in an uncomplicated format. I'm Dr. Shaunna Payne Gold, and I go by she, her, hers pronouns. And I am here with Dr. Lisa. How are you doing? And of course, we need the weather. Of course, we do. We need the weather.
Yes, hi everyone. Lisa Rinkerfield here, she, her pronouns, and it is torrential rain today. So, actually, quite unusual for Colorado to get so much rain. So, it's helpful for the drought and helpful for my shrubs and plants and such. But
hmm
uh, I know that someone I run with who lives about an hour into the mountains got snow. So, happy mid May snow.
Incredible. Well, that's why my sleep schedule is all messed up right now. We also had rain overnight and the thunderclaps that were around me. So, the end of the house that my bedroom is on is also near my neighbor's shed where he has his trash cans and other things. And so, a thunderclap can sometimes sound like a trash can being like tumbled over and drug out to the street. And I'm thinking to myself, he cannot be wrestling with that damn trash can much, right? And then I think I was dreaming and it woke me up out of my sleep. And then I look out my window and it's like lightning and everything. So yeah, my dream was reality. So we had some rain as well, which means my grass is going to grow quicker. So that's a good thing. That's a good thing. But good to be back with you. We are now on, which is unbelievable, episode 143. And we're going to start with the word of the week. And you'll see how it dovetails into where we're going, y'all. But the word that we chose, it's kind of a coupling of words. Many of you probably have heard the word generation, meaning what generation were you born in, for example, kind of a cohort of individuals that share time and space and history where they all recall similar things and experiences. And so I wanted to bring up the word gentelligence. Gentelligence. It's the combination of generation and intelligence. And it comes from a book by the same name. Gentelligence, the revolutionary approach to leading an intergenerational workforce. And Megan Gerhardt actually lived up to the title of the book by assembling a intergenerational group of authors to explore uh, generations in the workplace. And so they defined it as the ability to break down age based tensions and instead build up intergenerational power. And so I listened to the book and it was so doggone good. I actually bought a copy of it because I wanted to take a few more notes and pull some quotes and things from it that I've used in other places and spaces. But I thought it was a really good mashup, Lisa. It's very rare that I say mashup, but I think that was a good mashup between two words that can come up in lots of different settings, and especially as it relates to DEI work, of course.
Yeah, and it's a newer term, right? I don't think people have
hmm
been necessarily thinking about how that arrives in the workplace, but I think for phase one, we're going to talk about that. So,
hmm
just to kick us off here, Shauna, you recently did a 2 day training where
hmm
some generational tension emerged, right? And so I think there could be some learning in this for all of us if you want to share a little
Oh,
bit about your observations.
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. Well, I've done a good bit of this work in a couple of different places and spaces with different types of organizations and different industries. But intergenerational everything gets really interesting because if you're listening for it, you will certainly hear it, right? And so I had one individual that approached me and was just sharing with me how there had been some challenges, what she thought on the face of it were challenges with communication, meaning that individuals would speak up publicly in all staff meetings and so forth and challenge a vice president or another vice president or a chief of staff or the CEO of the company for that matter. And they would do this challenge publicly, seeking answers and also seeking accountability. And as I was listening, and then I got to know the organization more, and then I started to notice, oh, how interesting. The individuals that called that type of communication disrespectful identified as older, more experienced, more tenured in their field, and even just in the organization itself, while it was the opposite for those that were seen as some of the challengers, the rabble rousers, the disruptors, if you will. And what I found so fascinating about it, and as it relates to intergenerational DEI, is that I didn't see what was described as disrespectful and subversive and contentious and divisive, all of those words that don't sound so great. I didn't see it as that way at all. And maybe look, Lisa, here comes my 40-plus-year-old jaded Black woman approach, my lens to the world here, is that I wasn't even placing value on either one of those perspectives. I was thinking to myself, how can we have both groups be right, yet at the same time get clearer on everyone's point of view? So let me give you an example of this. I'm a Gen Xer. Some of the people that I was speaking to that identified this younger folk behavior as disrespectful and subversive and divisive, we all were very much educated, trained, and even mentored to not challenge um, division or bad performance or values that we don't agree upon, at least not in public. Now, we might do it behind the scenes, one on one, in a meeting, but we probably wouldn't do it in a public place and space. Whereas the young students that I've trained and worked with and mentored and taught in classrooms, I've encouraged that amongst them. I've been encouraged it amongst my children at school and everywhere else. And so I felt like the in between where I understood the older generations in that workplace and their experience based on how they were trained to be professionals. Yet I also understood the younger cohorts in that organization and the way they had been trained and mentored and supported to speak their mind and place value on what's important. And so I took the value piece off of that and said, it's not about good or bad. It's actually about different perspectives and how can we get all these different perspectives to work together. And so, Lisa, I've already outed myself. I know I'm a Gen Xer, and so I'm going to see things quite differently. But it was just a fascinating opportunity to take the good, bad, the villainizing off of things and get people to see each other's perspectives. And I don't know if we solved or gave them a cure to any of that. But I do think it's something valuable that we all should consider in regard
Mm-hmm.
to every place and space where it's going to be by default intergenerational, right?
Yeah, and I think that this can be the root of so many workplace struggles for implementing diversity, equity, and inclusion work, right? The nature of the DEI work, the depth or extent of that DEI work, I think, is bounded by your generation to some degree, right? Just talking generally, and how you think you should be. So there is going to be some people, Gen Xers most likely, who do a lot of work in the background around this, right? Whereas maybe younger millennials and Gen Zs, so they're folks that were born kind of at the turn of the century and into the 2010s, who are a lot more vocal because they perhaps don't have patience for the behind the scenes wheeling and dealing that prior generations have. And I think that's a product of the era in which they have grown up, right? Where they've seen a lot of really awful stuff. And so for them, it probably feels more urgent, right? Like it's not appropriate to just sit back and say nothing. Like you have to say something and you have to say it now. And that's completely fine. And then I'm just thinking, so smartphones came into existence. Well, they really took off around the time of the iPhone, which was around 2009, 2010. So
Right,
younger
right.
generations have only really known mobile phones in the context of a smartphone and having all that information immediately at their fingertips, right? Being able to get an answer without the, well, that's a great question. Let me go away and figure out what the answer is. And they're like, ding, 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 right? I can just get you the answer for that right now. So tell me right now what your answer is to that question. Um, so that's probably influencing those interactions too, and what value is placed on communication styles, I would imagine.
Mhm.
Hmm.
Oh, absolutely. Communication styles, decision making styles, um, the And again, my issue is actually not the differences in communication styles, differences in approach. My issue, which is very similar to the book Gentelligence, what they call out in it, is the villainizing of people for having a different approach to the work. So, for example, let's say I'm that Gen Xer that's like the stereotype Gen Xer where I didn't blast somebody in a meeting. I didn't speak up in that meeting, but I've been working 6 months on exactly what that young person just blasted the CEO on. That to me gets very interesting because from a Gen Xer perspective, if I was villainizing the younger generation, I'd be like, why was that even necessary? Why did you have to do that? You catch more flies with honey, whatever I want to say in promotion of my perspective. And then also the younger generation would be villainizing my generation by saying, you're not doing anything, at least not that they can see. You're not doing anything. You're not moving fast enough. You're complicit. You're part of the status quo. And so I think that whole villainizing piece of not assuming the best and or not assuming creating this whole fiction narrative of what you think is happening that may not be for both generations in both ways. The younger person is impatient and they're ready to ram a Mack truck through the organization. The older generation is too slow, taking too long, and incompetent. All these stereotypes are not necessarily true. And because we don't communicate about generations' perspectives and how the world has shaped how they see things, we'll never find that out. We'll never get to the root of preferred communication styles, preferred perspectives, and those perspectives being obliterated with the truth. We'll never get there. We'll never get there.
Mm. That's really interesting. I was reading an article in The Atlantic earlier today that was talking about protesting. It was kind of grew out of the student protests that are happening on college campuses
Mm,
right now, but it was
mm-hmm.
more of a comment on protesting in general and how in the last 20 years as compared to protests that happened in say the 60s and 70s in the United States, that any kind of protesting that involves kind of marching or gathering as large groups hasn't yielded the change, the kind of political or cultural change that has historically been seen from kind of similar kinds of protests a generation ago, right?
Oh,
And one
wow.
of the reasons the author talks about, because the author pulls on a bunch of research, is that historically, so like in the 1960s and the 1970s, as one example, a protest movement isn't just the protest, right? A protest movement is a lot of kind of backroom conversations, persuasion, negotiation, in addition to a million people marching, right? Whereas now, the protest movement or movements that engage protesting, I suppose, tend to only include the protest, the marching part of it, right? They don't
Oh,
also
interesting.
include to the same degree the backroom conversations, the negotiations, the strategy, the policy change that's happening kind of in tandem with the loud protest. Loud protest meaning not necessarily violent, but protest, like think of the Women's March, right? Think of other examples. There are lots of people and lots of people allowed. And so that was one of the reasons that was posited as to why you're not seeing the same kind of change grow out of these more recent protests in the last 20 years. And so I'm thinking about that as you're talking about this gentelligence and the ways in which we understand DEI, change. And that feels like a manifestation of that in some ways. That's outside of the workplace, but it's a manifestation of the way you used to do it is too slow. We need to
Yes,
be
yes.
upfront in people's faces. We need to be talking about these issues that are highly problematic without much attendance to, well, is that actually leading to any kind of social or sustainable change? So that's
Mm.
interesting.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Well, and this is the time of year, y'all. Dr. Lisa and I both come out of a higher ed background. This is the time of year for commencement, and what a better place, what a great place to protest. So we've seen even now what's going on in regard to protesting, all that's going on with Gaza and all of that. The commencements they have been found as a great place to do that protest. Now, whether anything comes of those protests at those very high profile events, great question. To your point, Lisa, I don't know. But, thinking about, for example, one of my clients, the University of Virginia, they just had a protest. And of course, the whole campus is antsy prior to their upcoming commencement that's happening. Columbia's commencement was canceled. Duke University had a protest at the commencement. These students are saying, even in moments where I'm about to receive my degree, I could, depending on the policies of the university, I could have my degree revoked at at the finish line. Yet it's worth it to me because whatever processes previous generations have been using are moving too slow for me. That's courage. That's big courage, and how that's interpreted is probably filtered by what generation you hail from.
Yeah. Yeah, I think it's absolutely filtered that way. And just
Mm-hmm.
to, I know that we're kind of out of time on this phase, but one thing that has occurred to me is the generation that's graduating from college right now, or the group of people rather than
Mm-hmm.
generation, I suppose, also didn't get their high school graduations because 4 years ago was
That's
COVID.
right.
So
That's
their
right.
their high school graduations were cancelled, and now potentially their college graduations are cancelled. So what kind of ripple effect is that going to have on this group of people who are now heading into the workforce around how they kind of think about diversity, equity, inclusion, how they think about protesting, how they think about
Mm-hmm.
results, right? And
Mm-hmm.
communication. So that's also going to be pretty interesting in the next decade to see how that plays out.
Mm-hmm. Oh yeah, they're feeling robbed big time feeling robbed. But Lisa, so we've talked about this intergenerational piece, but I wanted to get into, maybe this is generations across women. I don't know, but guide us into phase two, Lisa, in regard to this whole women and suffering piece here.
Well, that's a really interesting way to frame it. That Okay, so what we wanted to talk about was Shaunna had sent me a post related to an article that was talking about the ways in which women's identity or womanhood has been intertwined with notions of suffering to the point where women's suffering has just become normalized and an expected experience. So, one example would be, menstruation every month. People have varying degrees of cramps, some much worse than others, right? That can be debilitating, and the ways in which our systems haven't really responded to that or have just normalized that and downplayed that experience, right? We are seeing now workplaces provide days off, I think, for that, right? I'm not sure what they're calling it, but that's a very, very new thing, whereas this has been an issue that has been happening for ever, right? But women have to just suffer in silence, not talk about it, otherwise they're just considered complainers. Um, but I hadn't thought about that from a generational lens. So over time, these generations of women, the ways in which suffering and womanhood have been so closely tied together, like, is that bond loosening now for this current generation? So over the last 150, 200 years, that silence that women have been expected to hold and put up with all of this shit, right? And pain as normal, like, is that grip getting weaker, I guess? And so that would be the generational connection. So that's super interesting. Um, and we're also seeing more conversations about perimenopause, menopause, and postmenopause, right? Like, that has been an area that has received next to no attention, forever. And now in the last 5 years, we're seeing more conversation about that. We're seeing more conversation around women specific ailments like endometriosis, right? Which is where the inside of your uterus grows on the outside of your uterus, and that can cause a lot of pain. But there's next to no scientific research into that because it's never been funded. And then women's pain around that particular issue has been dismissed, ignored. They've been told that they're imagining things or that they have, some other ailment, and it can take years to get that diagnosis. So that's always been a problem. But now there almost seems like there's a corner that has been turned, and maybe I'm being overly optimistic, Shauna. But you know, like we just also went past Mother's Day, right? In the US, it's different in the UK. In the US, Mother's Day just happened, and all those cards that you see in the store, right? Thanks, Mom, for your sacrifice, for doing all those things for me, for basically giving up your sense of self for me
Mm-hmm.
for 20 years, right? I mean, you
Mm-hmm.
could probably speak more to that, Shauna, being a mom
Mm-hmm.
of two boys, right? Like, what are your thoughts on
Mm-hmm.
it?
Oh yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. No, what you're mentioning, which I appreciate, is the menstrual leave policies that started outside of the US but now are trying to trickle in, which is distinct from sick leave itself, which is that's federal law, of course. But to your point on the Mother's Day piece, absolutely. It's I have always said that the women and suffering piece is a damned if you do, damned if you don't situation, right? Because if you're seen as suffering, oh, you should do self care. Lisa, you remember the podcast we exchanged on self care? Just more self care, without implicating the systems that create the need for it. And then on the opposite end of things, the judgment that all genders place on parents, specifically women and mothers, around not suffering enough for their children. And so to me, I'm like, this is a damned if you do, damned if you don't situation, because I've been there, done that. Lisa, we've talked about this in previous conversations that were sports specific on, how dare you go run 10 miles before sunrise, before anyone in your house is up, because in some way, shape, or form, you're neglecting your kids by going on a run to train for a marathon before anyone would be awake anyway. That makes no sense. But yet, gain a few pounds or not work out for a few days, then all of a sudden you're neglecting yourself. It's like, hold up, you can have it both ways. You can't have it both ways. But that has been the grooming of uh, women as parents in society, is that there is no, I don't know, there is no negotiating point. And so that's why I'm like, at some point, women, we have to decide that we're not going to buy into the rhetoric of suffering on a continuum. Are you doing enough of it or not? No, we just have to buy out of that. And now, when
Mm-hmm.
it
Yeah.
comes to these other pieces of the puzzle, especially when it comes to menstruation, menopause, all of these other things that arise that are very real. Lisa, I don't know about you, and maybe it's just sadistic for me, but you and I have seen on social media where there's been kind of this experiment where there's a machine that's strapped to a man that has to it's trying to replicate like menstrual cramps or whatever, and they can't take it for like 2 minutes, and we're going days dealing with this, and we're still expected to work, and we're still expected to keep a household running, and we're still expected to do all these other normalcies of life, but they can't last 2 minutes. Like, no. And so I'm so appreciative that if we're going to be the majority of the workforce, then why aren't some of these policies leaning towards our needs? At the very least, because we're still not getting paid what we're worth. So the least you can do is, while we're not getting paid enough, to at least pay attention to what our bodies need to make the, what is it now, 78 cents for a dollar.
Yeah,
At least
thereabouts.
let us pay attention. At least let us pay attention to how our bodies are working or not working. So I think
Mm-hmm.
it's very interesting how tightly coupled womanhood is to suffering, and disrupting that becomes a problem for some people.
Yeah, like it's just acceptable, right? That your pain as a woman, as a mother, is just acceptable. Like it isn't even named as suffering, right? Or pain. It's just that's just you're kind of like that's your state of being, and that is acceptable and okay to
Yeah,
men and to
yeah,
kind of like our mainstream culture,
yeah.
as a normal thing. And if you complain about it, Shauna, then you're whining or you're ungrateful or you're not doing a good enough job or you're making it up or you're hysterical, right?
Yes,
I
yes,
mean,
yes.
there are countless examples that I've read in news pieces or watched on documentaries where women have been, in the ER because they've been in a tremendous amount of pain, and they are forgotten, they are ignored, they are underdiagnosed, right? They're told to just go home. So women have died of heart attacks because their symptoms are different than the publicly, the kind of like popularized examples of heart attacks. And then medical professionals have just dismissed their pain. And then obviously, if we think about racializing that, right, for Black women in particular in the United States context, their pain is dismissed to an even greater degree. Or even medical students, I believe, still buy into or are taught myths about pain tolerance for Black women, right?
Absolutely.
As
Absolutely.
yeah, yeah,
And
and so
something to your point, though, remind me to tell you about how CNN fed that, but finish your thought. Finish your thought.
oh, it's finished. No, you go.
Well, so Lisa, you and I will understand this from a former doctoral student perspective. On CNN this week, there was a young woman. Her name is Tamia Brever Rodriguez, a Black woman who, I don't know if she delivered early or late, what have you, but she delivered her son, and defended her doctoral dissertation a few hours later, right? Now, this was a story on CNN. I saw lots of Black women in my community sharing this out on social media. Oh my God, this is fantastic. Way to go. Da da da. And half of me split Shaunna in half. Half of me is saying, way to go. Way to go. It's both our accomplishments by themselves, much less together. Way to go. And then on the other half of me is saying, explicits. Let's put it that way. I am saying expletives as I'm looking at this story, because it, to me, was glamorizing how, once again, we've talked ad nauseum about the superwoman trope for Black women, period, as if we should normalize this. And any woman, but especially Black women who are striving to higher heights with their academic pursuits or having a child, please do not make this seem like this is the standard. This may have been her choice, and it may have been, journalism's choice to put this on CNN and all over the world. However, if you, for even a half a millisecond, think less of yourself because you can't do one, two, or both of the things she just did, this is inherently problematic. And it glamorizes the I can suffer through, I can make through. Like, thinking to myself, I pray that it was the student's choice to actually defend on that day and follow through after giving birth. Because if there was an expectation from that damn committee that she should show up no matter what or be rescheduled 100 years later, shame on them. So I know I'm jumping to a few conclusions here because we don't have all the information, but just the mere fact of this existing and people taking this as normalizing is extremely problematic for me. Extremely.
Yeah, like that, like it was celebrated. That's the problem, right? We don't know the circumstances around her choice. I mean, she could have
Mm-hmm.
chosen it and still felt coerced into choosing it because of some
Yes.
policy or something.
Oh, yes. Oh,
Well, and
yes.
then that, if that were the case, then that speaks to how policies, right, are not supportive of women's care and just assume that women's suffering is okay. I think, like, kind of
Right.
embedded implicitly in the policy. But
Mm-hmm.
yeah, so then
Mm-hmm.
and then it go CNN broadcasting that, to your point. Yeah, it's just it is underscoring that this is normal when it's not, when it should not be normal, right? Like that's
Mm-hmm.
like a friend of mine, a friend of mine's friend years ago gave
Uh-huh.
birth on her own in her basement. I forget what the circumstances were,
Oh, no.
but she was celebrated as a look at this great thing that she did. She's so tough. She was able to just give birth to her second child in the basement on her own because of whatever the circumstances were, right? And I am kind of like, well, that's freaking amazing. Like, I don't know how that happened or how you did that, but
Mm-hmm.
like, rather than being shocked, dismayed that she was in a situation where that had to happen and she had to do that herself with no one else there, right? Like, it was like, wow, what a strong woman you are, right? How amazing are you? right? And so it's not to downplay that that was kind of amazing, but also like then we're normalizing the fact that women should apparently just be able to exhibit these feats, and there should be no question about why was that circumstance even, why did that even happen, right?
Exactly. And with the disparities with Black maternal health in this country, you should have to think about nothing but your health and your baby's health at that point. For real. I mean, just come on. And so kudos, and I bow down to her if this was all her choice, but we know systems are always in play that force your hand to do some things that, yes, you seem to do it by choice, but I'm sorry. That gets real interesting when it comes to what we're expected to do and not do. And we haven't even gotten into academia and academic hazing. That's a whole nother podcast for women and people of color. That shit right there, I felt really gross,
Yeah.
just thinking that that would be okay. It's not okay. It's just not.
No, it's not. And I think that we need to keep talking about this. We need to keep talking about the fact that women's suffering is so often overlooked and just assumed to be like a normal
Mm-hmm.
and permanent part of our existence. So if you
Mm-hmm.
have women in your life, young girls, people
Mm-hmm.
who are having a really hard time of it in terms of pain. I mean, gosh, I have know so many women that refuse to get help for pain they're experiencing because they don't want to be a burden or they think that it's normal, right?
Oof.
Whereas a,
Yes.
a guy would
Yes.
have been at the ER in like 5 seconds, and that is it's a learned behavior. The going to the ER is what you should do, but they won't do it because this idea that you would be considered difficult or
Mm.
exaggerating, right? So
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
we have to be having these conversations much more
Yeah.
readily than we are. So
Yeah.
that's
Absolutely.
what that is all about.
Absolutely. Absolutely. No, I'm with you 100%. Been there, done that. Don't want to be there. Don't want to
Hmm.
do that. Don't want anyone else to do that. So,
Yeah. Yeah.
but oh, all right. So let's transition into phase three. My beloved state, y'all. Y'all know they're gonna act a fool on a regular basis. You might as well just get ready for my beloved Virginia to act a fool on something, right? All right. So let me give you the scoop on what has happened here. So Shenandoah County School Board voted 5-1 to rename Mountain View High School as Stonewall Jackson High School and Honey Run Elementary as Ashby Lee Elementary School, rather. And so this is a vote reversal. I know you all recall, because hopefully you all are devoted listeners. You recall a previous podcast where we talked about renamings in such a way that's been reflective of history and trying to be on the right side of history with names and people that stand for inclusion. But this vote is so interesting because it reverses a decision that was made in 2020 when all these names, Confederate names, were being removed across Virginia and actually through kind of going down into that Bible Belt area, especially in response to Black Lives Matter. And so, Lisa, this was interesting to me when you shared this particular link with me. This was interesting to me because I recall you being a very clear voice as we were recording in the 2021s about how we're noticing, us DEI people that have been doing this for years, we're noticing all of this uptick in DEI work in 2020. Let's see how long it lasts, because I bet you in a few years we're going to start reversing things, whether it's chief diversity officers, whether it's programs and initiatives, whether it's ERGs. Add this to the list of things that you predicted that would be rolled back. There were things where there was a movement and now we've rolled back. And I think what's interesting, I didn't even know this existed, y'all, until I reviewed this article. I knew Southern Poverty Law Center, I knew about their work, but I did not know that they maintained an entire database of all the Confederate memorials nationwide. And so even they have said that they have not heard of another case of a removal in order to restore a Confederate name. So even they are saying this is like unprecedented bullshit, right? So, I think this is interesting. Lisa, thank you for sharing this with me. Disgusting, yet not surprised. Here we go, Virginia. Here we go.
Yeah, yeah, I feel like Virginia and Tennessee there seems to be a lot of bad stuff that tends to be
Bad
in the
behavior.
news from those two states.
I
Um,
agree.
but I think, I think the reversal piece is what is so alarming to me. So the school board, this same school board, slightly different composition in 2020, but they voted to change the names of that high school and elementary school because they honored these Confederate slave owning individuals, right? And then to have some shift in the composition that you feel so strongly that it is an affront to history that you're actually going to bring it up and you are going to vote to reverse that decision and spend money to make that change. Because just think logistically about all that needed to happen to shift those two schools' names back when it was decided in 2020. Now you're going to go back in the other direction. And I know that they're saying that it's all going to be funded by private donations, et cetera, et cetera. But like, how disdainful or lacking in compassion must you be to actually reverse a vote and spend money, like not a small or insignificant amount of money, I would imagine, on changing the names back to these two people in the name of being, what do they say, like accurate representation of history or honoring the community's history? So what you're doing is you're honoring people who thought it was okay and legitimate to enslave other people. That's
Mm-hmm.
something you want to honor? Like,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
what? You could
Oh
have walked
yeah.
away from this.
Mm-hmm. Of course, of course. Well, and so not being from the area, but again, knowing the state and then also knowing the specificity of this school in this area. So, for example, a lot of people you all probably have heard of, for example, Robert E. Lee. You have not heard of Ashby Lee. Ashby Lee was named for General Lee, and Ashby Lee was a Confederate cavalry officer, and he was killed in Harrisonburg, Virginia, which is where my beloved James Madison University is. That's the area where the school is. And so, on one hand, yes, they're accurately describing the history of the state and the history of the locale, but you're honoring the history that was painful, harmful, and sucked for a lot of people. And so, therefore, it's this constant reminder of those who have viciously harmed people in this country and specifically in the state and in that location. And so, I think what's most alarming is can somebody send a list of those private donors that are sitting on ready to write the check to fund this? Because that is extremely telling to me in regard to, uh, yes, reverence of history, but also keeping alive. Like I've said this 1,000 times, it's almost like you can't go with the fact that you lost the fight. Like you lost, man. You lost, and it is not a shining part of history that you want to hold on to, but you continue to do it. Like literally like clamping down on it. And I don't I still will never understand why, again, not forgetting. I don't want anyone to forget what happened. I don't want to glorify what happened. And putting names on schools and monuments and so forth glorifies what happens. It's someone shared this in an article I read many, many months ago, Lisa, which connects with your area of expertise, but also at the same time kind of grossed me out a little bit. It's literally like putting the name of someone's violator or rapist on a school, a building, something that you have to go to or pass by every single day. And you're just supposed to live with it and be okay and get used to suffering. Since we were talking about that in the last phase, get used to suffering by seeing that shit. That's what the article talked about. And I kind of agree. Um, I kind of agree. It's a sucky reminder and glorification of something that should not be forgotten, but definitely should not be applauded by any stretch.
Yeah, and I know that community members had lobbied the school, and I guess the public hearing that went on for several hours with people on both sides of this. I'm not quite sure how you could be on the reinstatement side, but there you go. And folks did say that by having going back to those names after deciding that those names were harmful to students of color, particularly African American and Black students in the community, and then you're like, well, that doesn't matter, that's not enough. Like, that's, like, the reversal is what seems so wicked to me. I'm sure the debate to change the names in the first place was quite contentious, and it probably wasn't like a slam dunk. But then, like, to do it to the reversal, to say, no, actually we do want to glorify these people. And you know what the argument would be? Well, we need to, if we take their names off of the schools, then people are going to forget the history, which is just BS, because these same states are banning the discussion of racism and slavery and privilege in the schools. So then how exactly are you using it as an opportunity for education when teachers can't talk about this stuff in the classroom anyway, right? I mean, I don't know actually to the degree that Virginia has done that, but I wouldn't be shocked if Virginia has done that. And I worry that this is a little bit of a disturbing pattern, because you know how some of this stuff is contagious, right? So the Southern Poverty Law Center is saying this is the only one that they're aware of. But I'm a bit worried, because we have seen these trends of DEI officers or DEI offices being eliminated, right? Work towards creating more inclusive workplaces has been stopped. And so is this the first domino, right, in terms of the ways in which other Virginia schools, or then other schools primarily in the South probably, are going to turn around and go back in the other direction when they had made some semblance, even if only in kind of in name only, right? I realize it's symbolic, but of the things that you could do, changing a name is fairly low hanging fruit,
Oh
right?
yeah.
To
Oh
try
yeah.
and create inclusivity. So,
Oh yeah, absolutely.
yeah.
And so Lisa, real quick, after you just named that, as far as the coupling between, renaming so that we don't forget the history, yet completely banning certain history, all of that, exactly spot on. The Virginia is top 5 in the country for book banning, and we've had almost 400 book titles that were targeted for banning in Virginia in last year alone, not historically, just last year, right? So it's around 387. Except I double dog dare you, Lisa, to guess what's the top state, because you're going to know it. You're going to know the top state. Virginia's number 2. Who's number 1?
It's got to be Florida, right?
Ding, ding, ding. There you go. There you go. Exactly. Florida, where in Florida, hold up. Virginia doesn't sound so bad once you see the book banning Florida. Book banning in Florida,
Oh, dear
2,672.
Lord.
So, so given that you're right on target in regard to how people aren't thinking about how this is really, again, systems thinking. We're not thinking about the entire system that's making sure that folks do forget what happened, what really happened from both
Right.
sides. And that book banning,
Right.
name
Exactly.
changing, name reversals, it's all feeding back into that larger system of, you remember that that album many years ago when I was in college, The Miseducation of Lauryn Hill, a miseducation of a whole state, a whole country, based on the system that you're naming here. Incredible.
Yeah. Well, a whole generation, to bring it back to full circle,
Ugh.
right? Like a whole generation is going to be miseducated or undereducated. And then
Mm-hmm.
those folks are going to go work in workplaces. So we'll see how that plays out too, right? In
Mm-hmm.
addition to the stuff we talked about at the top of the show. Wow.
Mm-hmm.
Well, that,
Mm-hmm.
huh. All right. Well, with that nice little loop
Oof.
back to the beginning, let's wrap it up for this week.
Deep breaths, deep breaths, deep breath. No, Lisa, it's ironic that you mentioned that, because one of my posts that I posted on Mother's Day, one of the invisible invisible weights of being the mother of a non-white child, specifically a Black child, is educating your child on things that they don't learn at school. That was one of like the top 6 things. So again, all of our communities. Hopefully, I have some wonderful friends and allies that do great work on educating their kids about what they're not getting at school. Got to ramp up on that. So I appreciate you pointing that out. So we're at the end of another episode, y'all. Let me tell you where you can find us. You can find us on YouTube at Unfazed, Unedited. Go to Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Instagram. We're there at Unfazed Pod. LinkedIn, of course. Send us a question, y'all. I really appreciate how folks send in things, but especially if you have a question or if you want another word defined, we can help you out with that at info@unfazedpodcast.com, our website, unfazedpodcast.com, where you can access all the old and the new shows. Lisa, we are finally at the place now where we have, I think, we're getting there, where we have almost as many new archive episodes. We're getting there. But if you like this week's podcast, please like it, subscribe, leave a review, share with friends or coworkers in other phases of your life. So until next week, Dr. Lisa.
All right, see you next week.